Right, now just very minor recap. Yesterday, our main focus, having introduced the idea of looking at cost per QALY as information that might be useful to influence decision making, our main focus after introducing the principle of it was to look at one of the key building blocks, and that is trying to understand how much time patients will spend in different health states and how that will change as a consequence of treatment. Because those changes in the amount of time patients spend in different health states is a main driver of our QALYs, or quality adjusted life years. But having established, or at least talked about, the different approaches to predicting how much time patients will spend in different health states, the next step is how are we going to value that time? How much benefit do we get from patients spending more time in a better health state rather than less time in a poorer health state? How much benefit? And so that's what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to look at valuing time spent in different health states. In the afternoon, I'm going to look at a completely different, alternative set of approaches where we look at using money to value outcomes. And also we'll look at life satisfaction and well-being as a potential measure of benefit. But for this morning, I'm sticking with, as it were, what's become the conventional approach. And so another way of looking at this is how do we put the QA, the quality adjusted, into QALYs, the quality adjusted life year. Now you might wonder where this photograph comes from, or you might know. If you visit Tokyo Tower, there's a temple just beside Tokyo Tower. And if you walk by the back of it, you can look at these characters from behind. Now, as soon as I saw them, this suggests strange ways how my brain works, but as soon as I saw them, I thought, this is just like measuring QALYs, quality adjusted life years. We have a whole series of different measures available to us, but they're all kind of the same. So if you look at these individuals, they're really the same, but they're all a bit different from each other. They might be holding something different. Some have got a woolly hat on, some have something wrapped around their shoulder. So in a way, they're all just the same thing, but they're all a bit different, a bit individualized. Well, as we'll find in looking at how we put the QA into QALYs, the different measures available to us are really very similar, but different in distinct ways. So that's what will come out as we move through this. Okay, what I'm going to cover in this morning's lecture, I'm going to start with something called generic preference-based measures. And these are the mainstay of economic evaluation of healthcare. The generic is important because, in principle, if the measure's generic, we can use it widely across very differing areas of healthcare. And that's important because potentially it allows us to make comparative statements about the benefit we can generate by spending more on treating one form of cancer, or more on investing in improved mental health services, or more on respiratory care, or whatever. So the generic bit's quite important. But the preference-based element is also very important. It stems really, I think, from a broader tradition in economics that sees individuals as the best judges, generally, of their own welfare. And so in economics, there's quite a strong tradition that individuals should determine what's important to them rather than some expert or some external body saying, this is what matters to you. And so for that reason, as these measures have been developed over time and economists have been heavily involved, there's been this focus on preferences. So what determines health is different for different people. We can't, the suggestion is, we can't define health in some absolute way. It's different for different people. For example, in my case, a really important part of health for me is being able to be physically active. Now, actually, I can't be super active because I've got some health problems, but at least I'm not just sort of stuck in a chair. Now, other people, that might not be very important at all. Maybe the real most important thing is absence of pain or something like that. And that's fine. Different people have different things they value. And so given that recognition, health economists have built into their measures preferences, rather than, for example, some expert judgment. In the second phase of the lecture, I'm going to look at how we measure these preferences, or how we, in the jargon, elicit people's health state preferences. And I'm going to spend a bit of time particularly on something called time trade-off. Time trade-off, which obviously gets abbreviated to TTO. There are other approaches, and I'll mention them, but I won't go into so much detail. Then I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on one particular measure, the EQ5D. EQ stands for Euroqual, which in itself stands, I suppose, for European Quality of Life. And the 5D stands for 5 dimensions. And I'm going to focus on that one because it's probably, well, in fact, definitely, the most widely used generic preference-based measure in the world. I'm then going to close the lecture on an alternative approach. If you don't have access to EQ5D data, how might you use some other sort of health outcome data in order to generate your QALYs? And one approach is mapping. And in mapping, you're going from one particular measure, you're mapping it, you're translating it into, for example, EQ5Ds. So that's what we're going to cover. I'll try and be on time. We'll see. And as yesterday, do please comment, ask questions, whatever. Tell me to go faster, slower, you name it. Right, so what are the sources of health state values? And just to be I hope explicit as to what a health state value is, a health state is simply a description of somebody's health, and the health state value is a number we want to attach to being in that health state. And this number is going to indicate relatively how good or how bad that being in that health state is. There are two sources of health state values. There's generic measures and there's condition-specific health states. The generic measures include such things as the EQ5D I've just mentioned. You might sometimes come across the SF6D. The SF stands for short form. The 6D is 6 dimensions. What you may have come across is the SF36. Now the SF36 is a short form 36. It's a 36 item, it's not very short, a 36 item measure. It's not a preference-based measure. A SF36 score is derived by simply adding up the scores you get on each item. And each item is given an equal weight. So there's no preferences in it at all. SF6D utilizes a subset of the SF36 data and weights the different items based on people's preferences. You've probably never come across the 15D, 15 dimensions. It's a somewhat unwieldy measure developed in Finland and largely used in Finland. We won't go any further into it. Another measure is the AQAL, or the Assessment of Quality of Life. This is an Australian measure. I'll touch on it briefly. There's also the Health Utilities Index, which is abbreviated to the HUI, Health Utilities Index, which is a Canadian measure. And not to be left out, there's a US measure, the Quality of Wellbeing Scale, QWB. And really, for adults, that is the population of such measures, generic preference-based measures. Now, the alternative to using a generic measure is to use condition-specific data, so to use condition-specific health state descriptions and to value those condition-specific health states. And you could value them directly by using such measures as a standard gamble, which I won't have time to explain, or more likely the time trade-off, which I will be explaining. Or instead of valuing these condition-specific descriptions directly, you could value them indirectly, as I've mentioned earlier, by mapping. So you could look at the relationship between a condition-specific health state and the generic health states, such as EQ5D. In both cases, whether we're using condition-specific or we're using generic descriptions to start with, in both cases, the health-related quality of life, as it's called, is based on individuals' preferences and is expressed in such a way that it's on a scale from 0 to 1. Or should I say more accurately, on a scale that has a 0 and a 1, and 1 being the top of the scale, some notion of full health, you cannot get better than 1, and 0 being conventionally the value we assign to being dead. Now, I'm being very careful in saying these are 2 points on the scale because there is a possibility that you could be in a health state that's worse than dead. So it could be worse than 0. And I'll touch on this later on. Interestingly, not very common in Japan. Now, I don't know the reason why. It might be a cultural one, but we'll come back to that. But most health states are somewhere between 0 and 1. But there is this possibility of having a health state that attracts a negative score.
You listed those in your soil scales, and you mentioned the country from which or where they were developed. Is it because you assume, or people assume, that those value judgments are different from country to country?
Yes, we do, but that's not the reason we have different measures. The difference between the measures is what dimensions you're including. Now, that might differ between countries. The thing that really, almost for sure, we have evidence differs between countries is if we take a particular measure, such as EQ5D, and look at how it's valued in one country or another country, there's differences. And we'll touch on this later. But for example, the EQ5D is definitely valued differently in Japan from in England. Interestingly, I had I'll come back to it later on when we look at some of these country sets. So I think quite possibly the dimensions that are important will differ across countries, but we don't have much data on that. But the scores, or sometimes called the value set, the numbers attaching to different health states, the same description of the health state, but the score will differ across countries. Yeah. The fact that we've got measures developed in, Europe, US, Canada, Finland, Australia, that's more to do with academic factors I think, than anything else. Generic QALYs, generally speaking, at least by health economists, but also by people, decision makers using QALYs, generic QALYs are typically favoured over condition-specific QALYs. And the main reason for this is this issue of comparability. A generic QALY, in principle, it's the same thing that's being measured in the different healthcare areas. If instead you had a rheumatoid arthritis QALY and a prostate cancer QALY and a psoriasis QALY, it's not obvious whether they'd be the same thing. And so you'd lose the comparability. Now, for economic purposes, the comparability is really important because the main use of these sorts of measures is in trying to decide on the competing demands on our budget, which demands should be, as it were, approved or recognised and which should not be accepted. And so we're making comparative judgments about how we spend our money. So hence generic is important. Proponents of condition-specific QALYs would argue that condition-specific QALYs are going to be much more sensitive measures of health outcome, because they've been designed indeed to be responsive and sensitive. And so they would argue, more likely to capture changes in health. And so this debate is ongoing, but the dominant view currently, very much so, is that generic measures are going to prove more useful than condition-specific. Okay, for those who prefer, well, it's still words, but it's sort of a graphic. This is a sketch of what's going on. Everything starts with patients. It's the patients that are telling us what health state they're in. It's the patients that we give the EQ5D or the SF6D questionnaire to complete. So down here we have there's generic measures such as EQ5D, and as we'll see, these can be directly valued using a range of methods, but most commonly time trade-off, and you end up with generic health state values. You end up with a set of numbers attaching to the different health state descriptions, and these numbers indicate the relative goodness or badness of that health state. Just in passing, there's not many of these yet, but occasionally you'll come across a generic measure with what's called a condition-specific bolt-on. It's the idea that the generic measure is very useful, but it's maybe lacking some element that's important for a particular condition. And so you might bolt on some additional dimensions. An example of this would be, in the case of psoriasis, the typical generic measure is thought not to capture everything that's important to the patient. And in particular, for patients with psoriasis, itchiness of the condition is thought important, and also social stigma attaching to severe cases of psoriasis is thought important. And so an attempt has been made to take those additional dimensions and bolt them on, add them on to the generic measure. But as I say, this is not very commonly done. It does have a lot of problems associated with it. So I won't be spending a lot of time on that. The alternative is condition-specific measures. And if we're going to start with condition-specific measures, we have two options. We can map them to some generic health state. So map them, for example, to an EQ5D. Or we can directly value the condition-specific measures using such approaches as time trade-off, and we end up with our preference-based condition-specific values. And so we're going to have our condition-specific QALYs rather than our generic QALYs. And then these are the numbers, these are the measures of health outcome that feed into our cost-utility analysis or our economic evaluation. So how do we develop a generic measure? There's about 3 main stages. First of all, we need to develop a descriptive system. And of course, this involves a huge amount of qualitative work, discussing with a range of individuals and stakeholders and primarily patients what dimensions are important to them. And so you develop a descriptive system of health. And the EQ5D is a very simple descriptive system with only 5 dimensions: mobility, usual activities, self-care, pain, anxiety and depression. Now, once we've got the descriptive system, we need to do some kind of survey where we confront respondents with various health states or various health state descriptions, and we get them to value those health states, value time spent in those health states. And we use something like, well, for example, a time trade-off question, which I'll be showing you, to get this valuation. The final step is taking the data from our survey, which gives us some information on how this group of patients or the public or whoever have valued these health states. And we want to go from that to a general algorithm or formula which allows us to associate a score with every health state in the descriptive system. So that's 3 stages. First of all, develop a descriptive system. Secondly, in a survey, you collect some data scoring some of the health states in that system. And in the final stage, you model these scores so you can predict a score for any health state. This will become a little bit clearer as we get on to some examples. So, generic preference-based measures. This is just to remind you, EQ5D, I don't know if shares in it, but it's a world leader. It's the big one. SF6D, it's there. The HUE3, the most recent incarnation of the Health Utilities Index, is quite important. Otherwise, the other measures are not widely used. So, the EuroQAL or EQ5D, it's called the EuroQAL because researchers from about half a dozen European countries collaborated on it. And of course, it's a marketing ploy, it's a brand. Far better to have a catchy name like that. The QAL bit, I think in passing, quality of life, again, that's almost a branding issue. We're not measuring quality of life. Quality of life has so many different dimensions to it. It'd be bizarre if we thought we were measuring quality of life, but that's just what it's called. Sometimes people refine it and talk about health-related quality of life. Personally, I don't think that's very helpful either, because I don't know what's health-related and what's not health-related in terms of quality of life. But that's the terms that from history, we've been left with. I try and think of these things more as health state values, or simply numbers we attach to health state descriptions which represent the relative goodness or badness of time spent in that health state. And of course, it's a lot easier just to talk about quality of life, but it's not, that's just a label, okay? EQ5D, incidentally, is preferred by NICE, the organisation in England, which has got quite a major role in utilising this approach. They actually go as far as to say in their methods guide, they want to see the EQ5D used. That's not a reason for preferring it, but that's just a factual statement. The original EQ5D had 3 levels, and therefore is more accurately called EQ5D 3L, 3 levels. So by 3 levels, I mean each dimension, for example, mobility, there are 3 possible responses you could make. Now, that is so minimal. This should appeal to a Chinese audience culturally. It's so minimal. 5 dimensions, 3 levels. It was developed this way, I think, because the approach was very much to get something off the ground, something into use. And don't be too ambitious, don't go too big, don't make it too complicated. So 5, that's easy. 3 levels, simple. And in the sense that it's become established and quite widely used, it's been successful in that aim. I'm not convinced that we can really capture differences, all the important differences in health state, simply with 5 dimensions, or particularly just with 3 levels. That's where we've started from. In recent years, a 5-level version has become available, the EQ5D5L, and the idea being by having a slightly richer range of responses, you're going to get richer information. And it's really quite likely, it hasn't happened yet, but it's quite likely that it will supplant, the 5L version will supplant the 3L. And it's been the case, because it's been coming for a while, that quite a lot of clinical trials have been collecting the 5L data. And so in recent years, it's been less common for people to start collecting 3L. So what does it look like? Well, this is it. It's not any more complicated than this. The question that people are asked at the outset is, by placing a tick in one box in each group, please indicate which statement best describes your health today. So it's not which statement is an absolutely accurate description of where you are, it's which is best. So which, if you like, even which is the least bad, which of these is closest to where you are today. And for mobility, the 3 levels, I have no problems in walking about. I have some problems in walking about. I'm confined to bed. Similar structure for most of the others. Self-care, no problems, some problems. I'm unable to wash or dress. And similarly, pain, discomfort. No pain, moderate pain or discomfort, extreme pain. So it's very crude. And individuals simply tick the boxes. It doesn't take long to complete at all. And the health state we've got illustrated here gets labelled, for obvious reasons, 2112, because this individual has indicated they have some problems walking about and are moderately anxious or depressed, but otherwise no problems, hence the 2112. There are 243 ways to fill in this questionnaire. Well, this is not allowing for writing rude comments or whatever, as one does, or as one might do in elections. But different acceptable ways of filling in this questionnaire, 243. And it's 243 because that's 3 to the power of 5. And so it's based 3 levels, 5 dimensions. So just think about that. 243 ways makes, what's that song about? Something, 20 ways to leave your lover or something. Or I can't remember. Anyway, 243 ways to describe your health. Is it enough? Well, the strange thing is, you can survey quite a large group of patients and only a small subset of the 243 ever crops up. So while your first instinct might be, this is so crude, it can't be an adequate way of characterizing people's health, you might think there's some support for it, given that we see the 243 options don't get used. A much restricted set gets used. The 5L, well, obviously it's got 5 dimensions. I've just reproduced the mobility dimension and anxiety and depression here. So mobility, I think, is quite clear. We've got a potentially better measure here now. No problems walking about, slight problems, moderate, severe problems, I'm unable to walk about. In the old one, that I'm confined to bed, was just so extreme that it probably wasn't very helpful. Anxiety and depression, and also this wording goes rather similarly for the pain one. Not anxious or depressed, slightly, moderately, severely, extremely. Now, in the surveys in England, some individuals seem to have had a little difficulty distinguishing between severely depressed and extremely depressed. They didn't seem to have this problem in the Chinese version. So maybe linguistically, the difference between the Chinese equivalent of severe and the Chinese equivalent of extreme is much more transparent. I don't know. But certainly in England, there's some evidence that respondents found that this distinction between severely and extremely slightly challenging. By contrast, what does the AQAL look like, assessment of quality of life? Well, there's an AQAL 4D. The dimensions are independent living. That's a little bit like self-care. There's mental health, that's very similar to anxiety and depression. There's relationships, that's maybe a little bit different. And there's senses. Now, one of the criticisms of the EQ5D is with respect to people's senses, such as sight or hearing, it's not obviously a very good measure. So that might be a strength of the AQAL. There's a 6D where they add in coping and pain. There's a 7D where we add in visual impairment, and even an 8D where we add in, we've got 6D plus self-worth and happiness. Personally, I feel this smacks of a lack of confidence about what you're trying to measure, and they're trying to sort of cover all bases. They're trying to, you could put it more fairly and say that they're going to have quite a narrowly defined measure and a series of more broad measures, and they've got open minds as to what they're measuring. Developed and largely used in Australia. Valuation is a combination of time trade-off and visual analog scale. A visual analog scale is simply a line, usual with equal segments, and you ask somebody to score themselves on that line. Not thought a very good measure generally. So that's AQAL. HUI, the Health Utilities Index. Has any of you seen The Godfather, a trilogy of films? Well, you've never seen Godfather 1, have you? Because it's The Godfather, and then you get Godfather 2 and 3. Well, Health Utilities Index is just the same. So you don't start by having an index that's called HUI 1, Health Utilities 1. It's just the Health Utilities Index. And then over time, you get your sequels, the HUI 2 and the HUI 3. The HUI 3's popularity, relative popularity, I think is down to including cognition, vision, hearing, and speech. Because there are some health conditions where these elements are going to be quite important. EQ5D doesn't have that. Otherwise, back to our little statues outside Tokyo Tower, we've got ambulation, that's just mobility again. We've got pain again. Emotion is probably anxiety and depression. So, eliciting health state preferences. Whatever health state descriptive system we use, the next step is to get some scores, some numbers attaching to the different health states. There are a range of methods available, but far and away the most widely used is something called the time trade-off method. And in the time trade-off, this is an illustration for a chronic health state. The approach for temporary health states is slightly different, but let's focus on this. An individual is offered two alternatives. In the first alternative, they're going to live for some period of years, T years. Usually 10 is used. Live for 10 years, and then they're going to die. In the second alternative, the individual is going to live for some number, X years, in full health, and then they're going to die. And so the individual respondent is asked to choose between these two alternatives. But it's not just a case of choosing one alternative over the other. What the elicitation process is trying to do is find out what value of X, what period of time in full health would leave the respondent balanced between having 10 years of ill health or a shorter time of full health. And there's different ways of asking the question, but essentially you're trying to get to that point where the individual says, I really can't choose. They're the same for me. This shorter period in full health is the same to me is as attractive or unattractive as this 10-year period in the ill health state. And so the score that's then attached to the ill health state is X over T. And we'll see why that is in a minute. So essentially, you're asking the individual, what's the maximum number of years of life you would be willing to give up in order to enjoy full health, rather than your current ill health? Because that question identifies the T minus X, then you can get the X. Please.
You do that in the real interview,
yes,
face to face.
Most of the initial studies were done by interview face to face. Latterly, using computers, you're essentially being interviewed by the computer.
Right, and then when you do that, and when you say you vary, how in concrete terms do you do that? You ask, for example, you start with 5 years, and then if they say...
Quite a common approach is what's been called a ping-pong approach, where you offer a sort of quite a high value of X to start with, and if the individual rejects that or says, well, that's better than or accepts it, it's much better than the 10 years of ill health, you then offer them a lower value. And then they quite possibly reject the lower value, so you offer them a somewhat higher, and the ping pong is the back and forward.
Yeah, but then I suppose that the response would be different depending on which value you start with.
Yes, there's some evidence of that, starting point bias. And I think with all these things, there's no perfect way to ask the question. If you are concerned about starting point bias, you can, of course, then ultimately model the responses and put in as a covariate what your starting point was. So you can then standardize to control for it.
We're doing this not for an individual's health choices, but to gather data about thousands of people in Oxfordshire or in some location to get a policy base.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so it's typically for the individual, it's a hypothetical health state. The individual's not actually in this health state. They're given a description, such as our 21112 health state. They're asked to consider what it would be like to be in that health state for the next 10 years.
Sure, but then if you ask the same way to 1,000 people, that would bias only those 1,000 people. You have to vary those ways of asking across those 1,000 people. Then I would say that the starting point bias would not operate.
Good point. Right.
Yes. So as I say, you could, if you vary the starting point, you could then control for it.
Right.
But if you just start somewhere and don't vary it, you've no idea the extent of it.
Yes. Yeah. So my question is, do people do that?
There's been quite a wide range of different approaches. I couldn't characterize them all. as we'll see, it's been done in about 25 countries, and the design has varied in different ways over time in different countries. So there'll be some that have and some that definitely haven't.
Sorry for that, because what you described there is something I can read in books, but I'd like to ask you a specific question that I can only ask.
That's absolutely fine.
So let's say, when you interview someone and you want to get the responses, you say that, let's suppose you are fine with all those 5 domains, except for mobility, where you have some problems in walking about.
Yeah.
And let's assume you are going to live with this problem in the mobility, some problem in the mobility for 10 years. And would you like to trade that life for life in full health for 5 years? And then he says, oh no, I'd like to certainly live for 10 years with some problem in mobility. Then you would say, how about, let's say, 7.5 years or whatever.
Exactly.
So
that's what you do.
You want to go a little bit too far, then how about living for 9 years in full mobility in exchange for, with some problem in mobility for 10 years? Oh, well then I would like to say I prefer 9 years in full health. And then you go back to, let's say, how about then 8 years or 7 years?
Exactly what happens, yes.
Okay, fine.
Yeah. And hence the ping pong description, you're back and forward. Now, of course, that approach, which is really intuitively reasonable, has problems. Starting point bias, one issue. Also, if you don't start near the answer, it could be quite a long process. And so there's more opportunity for individuals to get fatigued or bored and disinterested. So there's issues definitely around this.
And then you also say that there are so many combinations of health status.
Yeah.
And so in this case, I only asked the person to suppose that you have one problem area where you have moderate difficulty. But there are some, combinations where you have some problem in mobility, no problem in self-care, but severe problem in usual activities and severe problem in anxiety and depression. And then let's suppose you're going to live in that status for 10 years, and would you like to trade off that 10 years for living in full health, say, for 5 years or something like that? Is that how you proceed?
Yeah.
Wow, so it's going to be a little bit, you demand a lot of imagination for people to imagine.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
The alternative, of course, is you go to experts who are experts in imagination, or experts, doctors perhaps, because they've seen it all. But who cares about their preferences? Well, they care about their own preferences, but why should the rest of us have a system based on their preferences?
Because we are interested only in the population average, you don't have to ask 10 questions of one person. You can ask only 3 questions of a person.
We'll come to that in a minute, and generally people have asked a lot of questions. Graphically, if it helps, and again, it may help some people, not others, along here we're measuring time, up here we're measuring the score we're attaching to the health state. So the 2 alternatives might be, alternative 1, it's some level of ill health, 10 years, or full health for a shorter period. And as I say, the process is to try and find that X, move the X about until the individual is indifferent between the 2 options. Or same graph, essentially we're, in QALY terms, the QALYs that health state A produce are W times 10. That's how many QALYs being in health state A would produce. And being in full health is going to produce 1 times X, 1 because we give a 1 to full health, X because that's the period of full health, plus 0 times 10 minus X, 0 because we assume death scores as 0. Rearrange these and you get W is X over 10. And so that's where the number comes from. The intuition is this: if you regard the health state as very bad, you'll be willing to give up more years of life. If you think the health state is not so bad, you might only be willing to give up a few months. And so that's going to affect the X, and it's going to therefore affect the score W. Right, this is quite a small one. These are the countries that have valued the EQ5D 3L using time trade-off. And they're an interesting mix. Japan is in here. Here. Let me explain the columns. Well, the country column is perhaps obvious. It's the country where the study was undertaken. One assumes the respondents were from the country, because usually people were selected on some sort of random process. And so, yes, they'll largely be from the country. The respondent column is the number of respondents in the survey. The health state column is the number of health states in total in the survey that are being valued. Not necessarily all being valued by the same individual, but in total, across the sample of individuals, how many of the EQ5D health states were valued. And then this fourth and the eighth column, is how many health states individual respondents were asked to value. And there's some quite interesting features here. Round of applause for Brazil. By doing a follow-up survey or a second survey, they in the end valued every EQ5D health state. We can compare that with, for example, back to minimalism in Japan. The Japanese survey, and some other countries, valued only 17 health states, but they got the respondents to value all 17. We can compare that. Look at Canada. They valued 48 health states in total, but didn't ask respondents to value more than 5. I think it's long winter nights, I'm not sure. Poland, they asked each respondent to value 23 health states. Now, to me, this is bizarre. How could these individuals still be engaged? I mean, this choosing a value of X for each health state, to do it 23 times is it's cruel and unnatural. It's some form of torture. But anyway, they did. Thailand is, for me, an interesting one. Valued quite a few health states, in total 83. Is one of my PhD students. She'd done a master's degree with me. She was a doctor specialising in rehabilitation medicine. And after the master's, she decided she'd like to do a PhD with me. And she said, well, I'd like to do something around economic evaluation of rehabilitation medicine. I said, fine. How are you going to measure health outcome? So she came back about a week later and said, I think EQ5D is a good measure. And I said, all right. And so you're going to measure outcomes in a Thai population with respect to rehabilitation medicine, and you're going to value the health outcome using UK measure, or what measure? And back a week later, she said, I don't want to use the British measure or any of these other measures. At that time, I think the Japanese measure existed. Also, there was a Korean measure. She didn't want to use those. She said, I'm going to collect health state values for EQ5D in Thailand. And so her PhD sort of flipped over from being an evaluation of interventions in rehabilitation medicine to being a nationally representative survey of health state preferences in Thailand. And she got funding from the Thai government. Didn't cost very much, because if you want to collect data in a country like Thailand, it's so much cheaper than collecting data, say, in England or, I guess, Japan. And she went and did it. And, well, how impressive for a PhD. The end of the story, of course, is we then compared the Thai values to the other countries. And the country the Thai values were most similar to was the British. So if she'd never done it and just used British values, that may not have mattered too much. But I tried to think why, what's going on? And the only only thing I could come up with in common between Thailand and Britain was driving on the left side of the road, as indeed happens in Japan. But the Japanese health state values are somewhat different. Before I leave this, I mean, it's kind of interesting, but I need to move on. Sweden rather stands out. 45,000 respondents, each valuing one health state. Well, in a way, I probably shouldn't put this one in here. They did use time trade-off. It is the EQ5D3L, but what this was a general sort of health survey in Sweden, very large survey, and they asked the respondents to complete the EQ5D questionnaire and to do the 2112 thing. And they then asked them, taking that health state, the health state you are currently in, they asked the time trade-off question. So imagine being in this health state for the next 10 years, then dying, or imagine a shorter period of full health. And so of all these respondents, these 45,000 were valuing the health state they were actually in. Everybody else is probably valuing a hypothetical health state. I mean, a handful of them might have been in the health state described, but generally not. So it's somewhat different.
And then are those values quite different from the others?
They don't stand out in the sense of being, oh, this is like something completely different. I mean, the different countries do vary, but there's nothing that makes the Swedish data look a degree different. Interestingly, in this very large survey, they came up with 148 different health states. In other words, there's about 100 health states that never occurred. Maybe not so strange, because of course, if you're in a really severe health state, you're not going to fill in this questionnaire, probably.
In other words, some of the other conditions are simply too hypothetical to be real in life.
There will be some combinations that would be very strange. I'm confined to bed, I'm unable to do self-care or any of my usual activities, I'm in extreme pain, but I'm not anxious or depressed. No, I think that would be, it's possible.
There's been a lot of cross-cultural research on death anxiety and terror theory and things like this. Presumably a culture that thinks death isn't a very bad thing at all might have different results from a country that's terrified of death.
Well, I know this is going to slow me down, but this directly strikes a chord with our Thai study. I was a bit concerned that the time trade-off question might not really work in Thailand. Thailand is, at least apart from the very southern part, is predominantly Buddhist in belief, and because of a belief in reincarnation and so on, there was a real possibility that giving up years of life might seem rather less important. And also, it's rather, from my flimsy grasp of Buddhist belief, it's rather important, as it were, not to be disabled and to be healthy. And I guess there's maybe some link that you're more likely to come back healthy if you are healthy to start, something like that. And so I thought there was a real prospect that time trade-off just would not make sense in Thailand. But the responses seem to be as sensible as any other country, shall I say. So it's quite interesting. Okay, I won't spend much time on this. This is the 5L. Again, Japan has been quite an early mover. A few other countries. One point here, one development is something called the discrete choice experiment, is another elicitation technique, and quite a lot of these countries have then been using a combination of time trade-off results and discrete choice experiments. I can't go into discrete choice experiments, I'm afraid. It's no time. Here's the Japanese value set for the 5L. And so in order to calculate the score for any health state any 5L health state, you simply plug in mobility number, you plug in the self-care number, and so on. This sort of 0.0616 is just a sort of statistical thing that the model fits better if you have a fixed decrement for any health state that's not full health. But
that model assumes simple additivity,
yep.
which is quite unlikely.
Well, overwhelmingly these models have. Some of them had some element of, shall we say, a sort of non-linearity. A lot of the 3L models used to have an added decrement if any of the levels were at level 3. And so if you had a level 3, not only did that sort of lower the score, it lowered it more, a sort of added penalty. And so that still additive, but moving away from a sort of simple linearity model. This is what's fitted the data. I mean, individuals have explored other models, but this has predominantly been what's thought to fit best. No interactions either. So how people are valuing or responding to different self-care levels is independent of how they've completed other dimensions. Now, whether that's because people haven't collected a rich enough data set to capture potential interaction effects, that's one possibility. But people have collected quite a lot of data and haven't found interaction effects. So
these numbers are the ratings that we would add into the value.
Yes, they are. Sorry, I did sketch over this. So you get your time trade-off responses. So you've got a pile of numbers, a series of numbers, under 1, some negative, but not very many. And you're then trying to explain that number. And you're explaining the number by what level were the different dimensions at in that choice. And your statistical model then allows you to say, well, if somebody is at level slight rather than no problem in mobility, this, on average, is going to lower their score by 0.0654.
So the critique of linearity isn't really completely accurate because these have already been weighted to be nonlinear. Your rating of slight mobility has different rating than slight self-care.
Oh, they have. Oh, yes. I mean, the dimensions have different weights,
Right.
Which is then wrapped up into the level. But you could still have a multiplicative model, would be an obvious alternative.
Sure. Linearity and additivity are two different things.
Exactly. And so this is additive, but it's not linear.
Yeah, right.
And what we tend to notice is as we move through the levels, at first the decrement is quite small, but tends to get larger.
I think this is like a fully factorial trial with 5 factors. And so if you have about 1,000 patients, I think you can examine the interaction with the same statistical power as for individual factors.
Well, yes. I mean, if we go back to the 5L, typically you've got quite a lot of data. You've got sample sizes of about 1,000. In effect, with the TTO valuing 10 of the health states and with the discrete choice experiment, 7 pairs. You've really got quite rich data. But of course, the 5L has 3,125 possible ways of completing it. 5 to the 5.
Yeah.
And so, whereas with the 3L, 243 possible health states, there's a lot more health states to value here. So maybe there's a question whether we've got quite enough data still. Okay, I better move on a bit. So that's the scoring system for 5L for Japan. Yeah, I'll just touch on this. Compared to the 3L Japanese tariff, there are fewer negative valuations. 2.5% of the 3L health states were scored as negative in the Japanese survey, whereas 0.1%, almost none, when none of the health states are scored as negative in the 5L. And so the minimum value, the value of being in that very worst health state, scoring 5 for everything, has a score of minus 0.025, whereas being at the worst health state for the 3L had a score of minus 0.106. So there's some change there. The greatest weight still attaches to mobility. But with the 5L, the weights attaching to anxiety and depression are much bigger than they used to be for the 3L. And interestingly, we've seen this phenomenon with other countries. The English value set, 3L, mobility was really most important. Moving to 5L, mobility is still important, but less so, and anxiety and depression. Now, is this something to do with the descriptive system? Is it to do with a change in the way we've listed preferences? Is it preferences have changed over time? The English study originally was done in 1993, the 3L, whereas the 5L data was collected in about 2015. So it might be preferences have changed, that we're less concerned about mobility. Now we have these motorized sort of wheelchairs. They're very, very, very common. They weren't, at least in Britain in the early 90s.
Do they ask those 5 questions in that fixed order?
Yes.
Well, I would say that is because of the initial effect and the terminal effect of Psychology 101.
That is a possibility. Obviously, some studies have explored ordering effects, and they've decided it's satisfactory to use a fixed order and not to randomize. But there you go. But yeah, I agree. I mean, they're top and bottom. So research comparing 3L and 5L is just starting up, and across the different countries, we are finding that the use of the 5L shifts mean utility scores upwards towards full health. So it's compressing the range compared to the 3L. We're finding now that improvements in quality of life are valued less highly using the 5L than the 3L. And if you use a 5L rather than the 3L tariff, you can get quite substantial differences in your estimates of cost effectiveness. Now this is a bit of a challenge. 5L is probably a better measure, but if you've taken your decisions for a number of years using the 3L, what are you going to do? Do you go back to decisions? Probably not. I think it's one of these bullets you bite and you just get on with it. And then in a few years' time, it won't matter because everyone's been using a 5L. Okay, mapping. So this is this thing here. We're going to talk about condition-specific data and mapping to a generic measure. Okay? Right. So mapping involves establishing the relationship between two series of numbers or two measures, A and B, and using that relationship to predict values for A using the observed values for B. A simple concept. You can map between generic measures. You can map from SF6D to 5D. Or more usefully, perhaps, you can map from condition-specific measures to a generic measure. For example, there's a condition-specific measure used for rheumatoid arthritis called the HAQ, or Health Assessment Questionnaire. You can map from that to an EQ5D. The motivation is that quite frequently we have trial data that didn't include measures such as EQ5D, but did include some condition-specific measures. And so we might then, it's quite attractive to take the data we do have and transform it or translate it, map it into EQ5D data we don't have. The main alternative to mapping would be just to go to literature, and so go away from the actual trial data you've got and go to the literature and see what scores people have assigned to the relevant health states. So mapping is potentially useful. I'll give you a cancer example, and mapping's been particularly widely used in the area of cancer because it used to be quite standard that measures of health states such as EQ5D were not collected in cancer trials. It's now changed substantially and they are being collected. But there's no fewer than 13 different studies have developed mapping algorithms from a specific cancer measure, the QLQ C30, Quality of Life Questionnaire C30, to the EQ5D. And another cancer measure is the FACT, or Functional Assessment of Cancer Therapy. And there's been 10 different studies, last time I looked, mapping from FACT or FACT measures to EQ5D. So it's been quite a cottage industry. The QLQ C30, some of you may have come across, very widely used in cancer studies. And the C30 refers to C for core and 30 items. And so there's a grouping of items or questions for physical functioning, role functioning, emotional functioning, cognitive functioning, social functioning. There's some symptom-specific items, nausea, vomiting, pain, fatigue, and then there's some single items. One that always puzzles me slightly is financial difficulties. It sort of stands out like a sore thumb among all the rest. There's also two questions about general health, which is also slightly odd. You've gone through all these, presumably because you think it's something to do with health, and then you ask about general health. But anyway, that's QLQ C30, really quite widely used. And cancer specific, or designed to be cancer specific. So a lot of these things either are a consequence of the cancer or a consequence of the treatments that are typical of the cancer. Hence the nausea and vomiting is very common with the treatments, and fatigue is very common as well. I'll give you one example. These are actually some former colleagues of mine in Aberdeen, Linda Mackenzie and Marion van der Poel. They did this mapping study quite a few years, almost a decade ago now, and they are mapping from the QLQ C30 to the EQ5D, and they had data for about 200 patients who had inoperable esophageal cancer, and they had 4 or 5 observations per patient over time, so sort of some longitudinal data. And they explored 4 possibilities. The first one is to try and predict the EQ5D overall score on the basis of the functional scale scores, the symptom scale scores, etc. Another possibility is to try and predict the dimension on each level, the level on each dimension. So the mobility score, the usual activity score, etc. Again, using the same variables. And then they repeated that study, the overall score and the dimension score, but using just the individual items rather than the group data, because they were trying to work out what seems to work best. And what they found was fairly similar results whether they used the group data or the 30 individual items. They then tested the predictions in the first two models in a separate set of data. So they had data for about 250 patients who'd had surgery for breast cancer. And again, they had about 4 observations per patient over time. And they found that both models, so that's these two models here, both these models over-predicted, but the dimension model over-predicted more. So in the end, they decided this was their preferred model, predicting the overall score and using the group data rather than the 30 items. They then did one final thing, which is quite interesting. They took data from a breast cancer trial where they did have EQ5D, but they also had QLQ-C30. And so they were able to compare the predicted QALY change using mapping, able to compare that with the actual QALY change because they had collected the EQ5D data. And what they found was really very similar results. So on average, across patients, between the control arm and the intervention arm, the change in QALYs was 0.19 when they used the EQ5D, but when they predicted what the EQ5D would have been on the basis of the QLQ-C30 data, they got an answer of 0.17. And so that's pretty close. Now, of course, that could just be chance, but they took that as support that mapping appeared to be working quite well. Now, of course, you wouldn't map if you didn't have to. If you have the actual data, you'd use the data. But if you haven't got the EQ5D or whichever measure you're using data, you might want to map because it gives you an opportunity to still calculate your QALYs using this measure. If you're interested in mapping, there's a website here that maintains a database of such studies. Looking across studies in general, what they tend to find is with mapped data, the confidence intervals around predicted values tend to be narrower than the confidence intervals for the scores for particular health states using actual EQ5D data. So you're sort of losing, I think, some information, and you're perhaps getting a false sense of certainty. You're understating uncertainty. But I think the key point is, whenever you use mapping in an economic evaluation, you've introduced more uncertainty because there's uncertainty about the algorithm. There's uncertainty about the relationship you've estimated between the cancer-specific, if it's cancer study, between the condition-specific data and the EQ5D. And so it's a second best. It's not really a desirable thing to do. But if you haven't got the alternative of the actual data, perhaps it's a useful option to map, albeit you're going to introduce additional uncertainty. Right. The alternative way of using condition-specific data is to generate QALYs directly. So describe the condition-specific health states and then use time trade-off or standard gamble or any other elicitation method in order to derive the weights that allow you to calculate the QALY. And give you one example of this. This sticking with the cancer. Still using the QLQ-C30. So with the QLQ-C30, remember, you've got all this data here. You've got 30 items, really quite rich data. And so the question is, how can we get from this quite rich data, how can we weight different items in order to get a preference-based measure. And that's what has happened with something called the EORTC-8D. They developed an 8-dimensional measure. So what they did first of all was take the initial 30 items, which is too much information, too many potential combinations, etc., and reduce that down to 10 items. Essentially, what they're saying is, of these 30 questions in the QLQ C30, 10 of them contain more information than the rest. Some items might in a way be duplicating, so you could get rid of them because they're not adding. Or some items may not be adding just very much knowledge or information. And so that gets them down from 30 items to 10. They then allocated 6 of the items to particular dimensions, and another 2 dimensions were based on a combination of 2 items. So this item reduction took place, and they end up with a measure that's got 8 attributes with 4 or 5 levels for each attribute. Compare that with the EQ5D5L, 5 attributes, 5 levels. But if you have 8 attributes with 4 or 5 levels, that gives you 82,000 potential health states. Now, it's probably still too many, but anyway, that's where they stopped. So they said, right, we've reduced the number of items, so our descriptive system, our EORTC-8D, is going to allow us to identify 82,000 different health states. They then have to value these health states, and the authors, Rowan et al., University of Sheffield in England, then selected 85 of these thousands of health states to value. And they asked a sample of respondents to time trade-off questions, and they asked each respondent to value 8 health states. So 8 of these EORTC-8D descriptions. And then they do a regression analysis of the responses, trying to explain the numbers that people gave in terms of what level each dimension was at. Again, an additive model. And here's a snapshot of the results. So instead of health states like 21112, we've now got a telephone number of a health state. And so this is an example for the health state 212323342. No answer. And it's a description of a health state. For example, you have a little trouble taking a long walk. You're not limited in pursuing your hobbies or other leisure activities. Pain interferes a little with daily activities. You feel quite depressed, and so on. And so taking the coefficients from their model, these things here, you can estimate a score for this health state. And the score is 1 minus these different bits. And we get 0.708. And so what they've done is they've produced a condition-specific QALY, a cancer QALY. Because they're using a descriptive system which is designed to be specific for cancer. It's preference-based. They've established how important mobility is compared to pain, compared to depression, compared to tiredness, nausea, etc. So it's going to be almost by definition more sensitive than EQ5D.
0.708 is the QALY.
It's the quality adjustment. This is the health state score. So time spent, a year in this health state will be scored at 0.708. And so a year in this health state would generate 0.708 of a QALY as compared to being in full health for a year. Personally, when I look at this, I don't think 0.708 is too bad. I might have scored it more lower, but anyway. Okay, so that's, I will close shortly. So a few final comments on generic versus condition-specific health state values. As I've said at the outset, I want to emphasize again, there is a preference for using generic QALYs because of this interest in comparability. If we take the cancer QALY, is that QALY more or less than a QALY that we'd get if we used EQ5D? We don't know. And so that's the big worry, that if you embrace condition-specific QALYs, you lose potentially comparability. Also, it's not very important, but research costs as well. With the EQ5D or any other generic preference-based measure, we've got the numbers. We can use them again and again. If we're going to develop condition-specific QALYs, we're doing this research fresh to some extent each time. Now that's great for academics, but it's not so good for anybody else. Condition-specific data, however, is richer. Typically, the data will be available at many more points in time. For example, QLQ-C30, you may have routinely collected every time the patient came in contact with the health care provider. EQ5D, you've had to bargain with the trialists to collect it at baseline and maybe once at 1 year or something. But of course, the big reason for condition-specific data being possibly better is it addresses directly the concerns of the patient. Now, EQ5D has been criticised quite widely for not explicitly including fatigue. And fatigue or tiredness is particularly important in the cancer area. Of course, EQ5D is still picking it up, because if you're really tired, that's going to have an impact on usual activities, maybe on mobility. It might have an impact on how anxious you are, etc. But it's not being picked up directly. And so I wouldn't, while I'm sort of embracing generic preference-based measures, I wouldn't try and argue that across the board they're better. I just think on balance it might be better working with them rather than moving to condition-specific. A few reasons here why condition-specific may not be better. You might design a measure that picks up lots of change, but the change is not actually very important. In a way, a merit of the EQ5D or some other generic measures is it needs something quite big to move it, to change it. And so you can be pretty sure if you're picking it up with EQ5D that it's a bit more real. Whereas some of the change you might pick up with a very sensitive measure may not be too important. The other problem with condition-specific measures is they might pick up important changes, but they may miss some important changes because they don't always capture the general health of the patient. They're so focused on condition-specific items, they can miss perhaps the impact of some comorbidities on general health. So they may not be broad enough. I think the final point I'd make here is it's not the best argument, but decision makers are used to using generic measures. They think they know how to interpret them. They're less sure about how to interpret condition-specific. And there's a summary. At least in the UK, there's a clear hierarchy. I'm not saying it should be the same everywhere else, but patient-reported EQ5D valued using public preferences. This is something I haven't gone into actually, public versus patient preferences, but public preferences. Then if you haven't got those data, EQ5D from the literature, if you haven't got that, map from other measures to EQ5D. And the least attractive is to look at alternatives to 5D, but then you need some evidence as to why the alternatives are better. And that's a good point to stop. One, because it is time for lunch, but two, we're going to look at alternatives in the afternoon at 1 o'clock. two alternatives, main alternatives, using money to value health outcomes, and the second one, using measures of life satisfaction or well-being, or alternately, possibly considering using happiness measures. Okay, so we stop there. Quick question?
Yesterday, you introduced which is an example of MDS, and I believe it's a congenital disease, so it would be difficult to assess the value of each space. So, could you show some idea for such difficult situations?
So,
children.
in children, yes, right. There are various measures in children, but there's one generic preference-based measure. Sorry for those people who, I'll find it somehow. And that's it, yeah. This thing, CHU9D, is the Child Health Utility Index, 9 dimensions. And it's the first preference-based generic measure designed for children. It's been designed for children aged 8 years and upwards, although I've been doing some research with it where by changing the technology of collecting data, using animation on a tablet, we've collected data from as young as 4 years old. Now, the dimensions of this and the levels have been carefully chosen to be more relevant to children. Everything else is an adult measure, and what's relevant for adult may not be relevant at all for children, or certainly less relevant. We don't have a huge amount of data on it yet, and there's a very interesting problem for economic evaluation, and that is if the condition has consequences over time. Initially the child is a child, but in due course they're going to be adolescent and then young adult and so on. How do we get a consistent QALY estimate over time? Because if we start by measuring the CHU9D, it's very relevant to them, but then as they become adult or nearer adulthood, do we change to a different measure? So there's a lot of problems we haven't faced yet. But I think with respect to specific question, I think things like EQ5D, they have been used with children, but they're not designed for children. CHU9D is probably the best bet. There are a lot of other measures, things like PEDS QAL, PEDS QL, but it's not a preference-based measure. It's back to a measure where you score different items and you treat all items equally and add them up.
Ultimately, can we use overall survival rather than quality adjusted survival in MD situation? No.
Certainly we can, but the counter-argument is there's more important. We don't just care about life or death or survival. We're interested in the nature of the survival. So there are a lot of studies that do calculate, for example, as a measure of cost effectiveness, the cost of an additional life year. And so it's just a year of life. It's saying nothing about how that year of life is lived, but it's a cost per additional year of life. And that's certainly a possibility. But for many conditions, people feel, I think correctly, that you've got to consider something about the nature of the life as well, and not just whether somebody's alive or dead. But with respect to some pediatric conditions, maybe that's the best we can do, just look at life years gained and focus on that. Yeah. Okay, thank you for your question. Okay, right, thanks very much. We resume in an hour, yes, 1 o'clock. Okay, thanks.